Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are tackling, it is just a monumental stack of
Oh,
sources.
absolutely. We've basically got the foundational operating system of the human mind laid out right here in front of us.
We do. We're embarking on a really fundamental exploration of general
A
psychology.
huge topic.
Huge. And the sources you, the learner, have shared with us cover this. Just astonishing range. Everything from the microscopic mechanics of sensation.
Like how your ear actually translates a vibration into a thought.
Right, all the way up to these complex social rituals that, drive our motivations.
Mm.
So, our mission today is pretty clear. We want to give you the fastest route to a real contextual understanding.
And we are really aiming to deliver that. We want to distill the most crucial and I think often the most surprising insights into how the mind actually works.
How we perceive, how we remember.
And what hidden, deep-seated mechanisms are really driving our behavior, often, way below the surface of our awareness.
Okay, let's just jump right in, but we have to start with a core philosophical caveat about the science of psychology itself.
Yes.
The sources introduce this crucial idea immediately. This field is, in a way, inherently unstable. The facts aren't stable.
Because the subject of study the human mind, it changes as we study it.
That is such a fascinating tension.
It is. I mean, the core goals of psychology are standard for any science, right?
Yeah.
Describe, explain, predict, and ultimately, influence behavior.
But unlike physics, where studying gravity doesn't make gravity decide to do something different.
Exactly. The human mind reacts. It's sensitive, it's adaptive, and it reacts to the knowledge that we publish about it.
It's this profound feedback loop, and it makes psychological concepts feel almost fragile.
It does. If a psychologist publishes a groundbreaking theory, that theory itself can actually influence the very behavior it was trying to study. It can change it forever.
It's almost self-mitigating.
Precisely. And that's why these concepts are so rarely definitive, unchanging explanations. The original theories have to be constantly adjusted or changed, or sometimes just outright rejected.
Because the underlying behavior has shifted.
Yes. Just think about the data from, say, 40 or 50 years ago on human motivation, on sexuality, on gender differences.
Right.
A lot of that data is obsolete now. And not just because our research methods got better, it's because society internalized and reacted to and ultimately just evolved past the psychological assumptions of that era.
And we have some classic, pretty startling examples of that influence right here in the sources. Early thinkers causing these measurable shifts just by publishing their work.
You have to start with Sigmund Freud. He was operating in a very specific, highly restrictive social environment. I mean, we're talking about massive Victorian sexual repression.
The context is everything.
It is. And his very focus on this restriction, the act of just making those drives visible and bringing them into the public conversation, that likely triggered their gradual mitigation over the decades.
He named the thing.
He named the thing, and in naming it, he started the process of its deconstruction.
Then there's the most dramatic American example we have, the Kinsey reports.
Published in 1948 and 1953. I mean, these were extensive, absolutely groundbreaking surveys on American sexual behavior, the first of their kind.
And the very act of publishing that data.
It changed everything, showing the true prevalence of practices like premarital sex, masturbation, things that were intensely taboo at the time. It clearly resulted in a much greater, faster increase in public tolerance.
People realized their private behavior was actually pretty common.
Exactly. And the social pressure just started to ease. The information itself fundamentally changed the object it was describing.
So as we go through this deep dive, we have to carry that tension between scientific neutrality and societal influence as this essential backdrop to everything.
It's the key.
Okay, let's move into section 1 and really tackle the foundational vocabulary of our inner life. If we're going to study the mind, we have to start with definitions.
And the most ancient concept, it comes from the Greek term psyche, which our sources refer to as psychika. It's derived from the word for soul.
But that's not really the term we use now, is it?
No, in contemporary psychology, especially among neurologists and the more biologically oriented researchers, the strong preference is for the term mind.
And why is that?
Well, using mind really emphasizes the necessary, very close link between nervous system activity and all our mental processes. It just carries a more explicit scientific and, frankly, less metaphysical connotation than soul or psychika.
Right. And the philosopher John Searle gave us a pretty clear working definition of the human mind. He framed it as a kind of running record.
An ongoing stream, exactly.
Yeah.
A sequence of thoughts, feelings, and experiences, whether they're conscious or unconscious, that, together they form the entirety of our psychological life.
And that psychological life is defined by what the sources call subjective experience.
This is our continuous internal awareness. It includes awareness of the external world, of course, but also the internal state of our own body. And this is critical awareness of our own mind.
The process of self-reflection.
That's it. That subjective experience is really the raw material of our existence.
I really appreciate how the sources break down the dimensions of that experience. It's not just a snapshot of right now.
Exactly. It has a crucial relational dimension, which is all about our emotional ties, our embeddedness in social groups. We aren't isolated units,
And then there's the temporal dimension.
which is perhaps the most uniquely human part. We are constantly considering our past actions and, projecting ourselves into our future goals and intentions. The sources highlight this fundamental human need for an open future.
An open future. That's a powerful phrase. What does that mean in, concrete psychological terms?
It's the hopeful, necessary perspective that allows us to plan, to delay gratification, to tolerate all sorts of difficulties today because we have some positive future goal.
So if a person feels their future is closed off,
Their psychological well-being just collapses. The ability to conceptualize an open future is what anchors us in intentional behavior.
okay, so we have our core subject, the mind, defined by this subjective experience and the need for an open future. Now, how do researchers actually approach studying it?
Because as we saw with Freud and Kinsey, there's no single way.
Right. We have 5 major theoretical approaches that really dominate the field.
And they each define the subject of study in a fundamentally different way. You start with the biological approach.
Which sees the mind as a product of the brain. Genes, brain structures, biochemistry.
Then the classic behavioral approach, which traditionally just dismissed inner experience entirely, it focused purely on observable responses to stimuli.
Then we have the psychodynamic approach, rooted in Freud. Unconscious drives, hidden conflicts, the whole ego, id, superego structure.
And then the dominant modern paradigm, the cognitive approach, which sees the mind as a kind of elaborate information processor, looking at inputs, throughputs, outputs.
And finally, the phenomenological approach. The sources give us a really interesting insight on this one, highlighting its philosophical weight, but also its practical weaknesses.
Yes, phenomenological psychology places subjective experience and self-awareness above all else. Its goal is to understand the world as experienced by the individual.
Which sounds great philosophically.
No, it's very rich, but it relies so heavily on internal, private, personal experience that it becomes extremely difficult to observe, to measure, or to test in any systematic way.
It sounds like it can lead you into a trap of circular reasoning.
It often does. When you try to define core concepts using only subjective reports, you end up with definitions that just lack external validation. Like the example in the sources, man has free will because he has free will.
Right, there's no way out of that loop.
Exactly. Without external reference, the explanatory power is just inherently limited.
And this struggle to define the self brings us right to the biggest argument in all of psychology and philosophy, the problem of consciousness, the mind-body debate.
Are the mental and the physical one and the same, or are they separate? This is the classic debate, characterized by 2 opposing views, mentalism and materialism.
Mentalism upholds concepts like absolute free will, truly intentional action.
Yes, it emphasizes the existence of mental phenomena, feelings, intentions, thoughts, as being independent of central nervous system activity.
And the argument for that is?
Well, a key argument for mentalists is that human experience is just so complex that it's best explained using psychological language. Terms like hope, ambition, jealousy.
You can't just boil that down to neurons firing.
That's the argument. Saying a specific firing pattern of neurons caused that jealousy just feels insufficient. They argue that the psychological level of description is essential and you can't reduce it.
Okay, so then you have materialism or naturalism, which takes the completely opposite view.
Materialists assume that all mental phenomena, everything we think and feel and experience, arise purely from brain activity. Consciousness is just an emergent property of a complex physical system,
But early behaviorism just ignored it entirely.
which the sources rightly call a sad period in psychology. But modern materialist views, they accept internal experience, but they insist it can be explained entirely in physical, measurable terms.
So if it's just a physical phenomenon, why did it evolve? What's its purpose?
The materialist view leans very heavily on evolutionary theory here. The idea is that consciousness emerged at a certain stage of brain development because it offered a significant survival advantage.
It allowed for more flexible adaptation.
Exactly. More perfected adaptation to a complex and changing environment compared to the rigid instinctual behaviors of our ancestors. It offers superior adaptability.
The sources talk about a crucial turning point, though, when this debate shifted and psychology sort of corrected its course, the rehabilitation of consciousness.
This was a decisive shift in the 1960s, the rise of humanistic psychology and the cognitive revolution.
So the humanists, like James Birchental,
They forcefully argued that this continuous, multi-level self-awareness is absolutely central to the human experience. They focused intensely on the possibility of genuine free choice and intentional action.
and the cognitive revolution gave us the tools to actually study it again.
Exactly. The sources kind of lament that the field allowed behaviorism to blind researchers to this crucial topic for so long. Cognitive scientists saw consciousness as a legitimate problem that needed to be confronted and solved.
And that work on split brain patients offers some, well, fascinating and slightly terrifying insight into where consciousness might actually reside.
These experiments were on patients whose corpus callosum, the bridge connecting the two brain hemispheres, was severed. And they showed that while both hemispheres can process sensory input, the left hemisphere is typically the one that produces complex speech. It describes the behavior.
So if you show a picture of a key only to the right hemisphere,
The patient can't name the key, even though their right hand, controlled by the left hemisphere, might be able to pick it out of a pile.
the key takeaway being that verbal awareness seems really tightly connected to the ability to verbally describe something.
It seems to be. They even tested this with smell, which is unique because that information doesn't typically cross hemispheres.
And they found the same thing.
The same thing. If the scent info only reached the right hemisphere, the patient couldn't verbally describe it using their left hemisphere speech centers. The inability to verbalize the experience seemed to equate to a lack of conscious awareness of it.
That's a huge, almost unsettling takeaway. That perhaps consciousness, as we experience it, is essentially our inner narrative, the function of the brain that can put the experience into words.
It's the part that tells the story. And this observation sets up the ultimate challenge we're going to return to at the end, the skepticism about the true extent of human free will.
Right, because if consciousness is just the system that interprets actions.
We have to consider the analogy from the philosopher Daniel Dennett that's cited in our material.
What's the Dennett analogy?
Dennett suggests that statements about conscious experience often sound like the messages of a government spokesperson who is, himself, outside the circle of those making the important policy decisions.
So the conscious mind, the spokesperson, it just interprets and rationalizes actions that are, in fact, already determined by internal nervous programs or unconscious drives.
It feels like choice, but it might just be interpretation after the fact.
That is a very heavy note to start Section 2 on. But let's dive into the architecture of perception. Before the mind can interpret the world, the body has to receive it.
And we have to start with sensation, sensory limits, and the minimum change we can actually detect.
This is all about measuring sensory thresholds, specifically the just noticeable difference, which was formalized a long time ago in the Weber-Fechner law.
And that law, stated formally, it's very dense. It says the intensity of sensation is directly proportional to the logarithm of the stimulus intensity.
Okay, let's unpack that. What does that actually mean for us on a day-to-day basis?
It means that to notice a change, that change has to be a constant proportion of the original stimulus.
So if you're listening to quiet music.
Right, turning the volume up by just 2 units might be immediately noticeable.
Yeah.
But if you're listening to that same music at full blast, you might need to turn it up by 20 units to notice the same proportional difference in volume. The threshold shifts based on the starting intensity.
And the sources have this fascinating comparative data showing how finely tuned our different senses are. Which sense wins for discrimination?
Surprisingly, our sense of hearing, specifically for sound frequency or pitch, it has the lowest Weber constant, an astonishing 0.003.
Wow.
This means we can detect extremely subtle proportional changes in pitch. A tiny percentage change in vibration is enough for us to notice.
So our ears are incredibly sensitive instruments. What about the weakest sense, the one that requires the biggest change?
That would be our sense of taste concentration. It has the highest Weber constant, at 0.20. In practical terms, this means we're relatively poor at differentiating concentrations. You need a much higher relative change in the amount of sugar or salt to notice a difference.
That really puts the sophistication of our auditory system in perspective. Let's move to visual perception. specifically the color theories, where we have two dominant and initially conflicting theories.
Right. First, you have the long-standing trichromatic theory from Young and Helmholtz. This theory is purely additive. It's based on the principle that if you mix blue, green, and red light, you can create all the color shades we know,
And the theory was that our visual system must have three types of receptors.
which was later confirmed by modern biochemical research. Researchers found three types of cone photosensitive pigments in the retina, each highly sensitive to a specific range of light wavelengths: blue, green, and red. It was a huge triumph for the theory.
It had some crucial limitations, things it just couldn't explain.
Yes. Most notably, it cannot explain complementary afterimages. Why staring at a bright green object and then looking away produces a reddish residual image.
And even more damningly.
It can't explain why individuals with red-green color blindness, who theoretically lack or have impaired red and green receptors, can still perceive and distinguish yellow.
Which, according to the trichromatic model, requires the stimulation of both red and green receptors.
Exactly. It's a major hole in the theory.
And that's where the opponent process theory from Ewald Hering comes in to sort of clean up those explanatory gaps.
Hering proposed that color vision works based on three pairs of opponent color units: red, green, blue, yellow, and black, white. So when one member of a pair is stimulated, the other is inhibited.
Which neatly resolves the after-image problem.
It does. If you stare at a green surface for a long time, you fatigue or tire out the neural components responsible for processing green in that red-green unit,
So when you look at a neutral white surface,
which stimulates both green and red equally. The exhausted green component doesn't react, but the red component does. And that results in a reddish afterimage. It's a rebound effect.
so the modern synthesis is that we actually need both theories. They're describing processes at different levels of the visual system.
Correct. The trichromatic theory accurately describes what's happening at the very first stage, at the receptor level in the retina. The opponent process theory explains what happens further up the neural pathway in the ganglion cells and the visual cortex.
Okay, shifting to auditory processing. We perceive sound as waves, defined by frequency and amplitude. The human range is huge, 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. But the core mystery is, how does the inner ear translate that vast spectrum into neural signals the brain can actually understand?
That's the coding mystery. And just like with color, we need two theories to explain the full range. For lower frequencies, up to about 4,000 hertz, we rely on the frequency or volley theory.
And this suggests that nerve fibers fire in a synchronized way.
Like a well-coordinated military volley, exactly, with each fiber carrying impulses slightly delayed from the others. This allows the total rate of neural impulses to match the sound frequency.
So for a 100 hertz frequency, the nerves fire 100 times per second through this coordinated effort. But why does that fail at 4,000 hertz?
Because the individual physical firing rate of a single neuron just maxes out around that speed. You can't physically get a nerve fiber to fire fast enough to track a 10,000 hertz sound.
So for the higher frequencies, we move to the place theory.
Exactly. The place theory explains sound coding based on the specific location of receptor stimulation within the inner ear's basilar membrane. Different high frequencies cause different parts of the membrane to vibrate the most. The brain interprets the pitch based on where the signal is coming from, not how fast the nerves are firing.
So we now know both mechanisms are crucial.
Both are. They're essential for explaining the full complexity of human hearing.
Let's talk about a sense that's often underrated, but which the sources highlight as profoundly important for memory and even evolution: smell or olfaction.
Olfaction. Humans have about 10 million olfactory receptors, which sounds impressive,
Until you compare us to dogs.
right, who have around 200 million. For us, smell is critical for orientation, for acting as an early warning system, and, maybe most fascinatingly, for memory recall.
A scent can just instantly bring you back.
Powerfully. It evokes an emotionally colored experience from years ago because the olfactory bulb has these direct, deep connections to the limbic system, the emotional brain.
But the most intriguing evolutionary insight here is its role in subconscious intraspecies communication.
Yes, this is where chemical signals, pheromones, come into play. Studies have shown that women, for instance, often prefer the scent of men whose immune system genes are significantly different from their own.
And why is that important?
Well, from an evolutionary standpoint, this suggests a powerful unconscious drive to increase the genetic resilience and adaptability of potential offspring by mixing diverse immune profiles.
It's like a subtle chemical compatibility test.
And it's happening completely without our conscious awareness.
Mm.
This biological imperative influences our perception.
This moves us perfectly from sensation, the raw data, to perception, the idea that what we experience is not passive input, but an active interpretation. We're shifting from bottom-up processes to top-down processes.
Sensation is bottom-up. It starts with the receptors feeding data to the brain. Perception is top-down, and it's heavily influenced by our existing internal knowledge, our expectations, our cognitive frameworks, our motivations,
Our brain is constantly predicting the world.
constantly. And the Lackner and Garrett experiment really drives this home, showing how our expectations influence what we hear.
In this famous study, subjects got an ambiguous, confusing message in one ear.
And at the same time, a clear verbal hint was sent to the other ear that suggested how the ambiguous message should be interpreted.
And the subjects consistently interpreted the message in line with the hint, even if they couldn't consciously report hearing the hint.
Exactly. This proved that our internal expectations, our top-down knowledge, are already influencing perception at a very deep level. The brain processed the meaning of the hint before it consciously selected which message to focus on.
And this interpretative process is often called projection in psychology. We attribute our internal content to the outside world.
Projection is the externalization of our inner contents, attributing our own traits, feelings, anxieties, or wishes to other people, or seeing them reflected in external objects. In the cognitive view, this is essentially a top-down process where our internal schema and biases are fitted onto and sometimes distort the external world.
And sometimes that top-down influence is driven by powerful biological desires, what we call motivated perception.
This is a really robust psychological finding. Strong internal motivations demonstrably influence how we perceive the world. For example, research has consistently shown that sexually aroused men perceive women as significantly more sexually attractive than unaroused men do.
The internal state filters the external reality.
It does. And this specific finding is, of course, leveraged heavily by industry.
By market psychology.
It's extensively. Advertisements are designed not just to show a product, but to pair that product with images and concepts that carry high social value: youth, health, beauty, status. By associating the product with those desirable images, they are drawing on our underlying motivations and top-down processing to make the product seem inherently more valuable and appealing.
All right, section 3. We're diving into learning, memory, and the unreliable past. Let's start with the fundamental ways we acquire new behaviors, beginning with classical conditioning, the Pavlovian principles.
Classical conditioning is really the bedrock of associative learning, the association of innate, unlearned responses with new, previously neutral stimuli.
It seems so simple, like Pavlov's dog salivating to a bell, but it profoundly shapes our behavior.
It does, especially concerning emotional responses and, critically, addictions.
Let's detail that connection to drug dependencies. It's more than just a simple habit.
It's a powerful chain reaction. A psychoactive substance, like alcohol, serves as the unconditioned stimulus, US. It naturally causes a pleasant psychological or physiological unconditioned response, UR.
But over time, the environment itself becomes a trigger.
Exactly. The taste, which might be initially unpleasant, or the ritualistic environment, the bar, the couch, the moment of lighting a cigarette, that becomes the conditioned stimulus, CS.
And that conditioned stimulus can now trigger the craving all by itself.
Yes, the CS triggers that pleasant conditioned response, causing powerful cravings long before the substance is even consumed. This explains why someone trying to quit might feel an intense craving just by walking past their favorite pub. The setting itself is a powerful trigger.
And this principle isn't limited to addiction. It really affects our social interactions, too.
Oh, subtly, all the time. Pavlovian conditioning influences our sympathies and antipathies toward people we barely know. We're often unsympathetic towards, say, the doctor who delivered bad news, even if they were just doing their job.
And conversely,
We tend to perceive people we met during really happy, successful periods of our lives as more sympathetic and trustworthy, regardless of their actual character. We associate the emotional state with the person.
but the evolutionary perspective introduced a crucial biological caveat to pure conditioning: the Garcia effect.
This comes from the famous experiment by John Garcia and Robert Kohling. They exposed thirsty rats to a salt solution, and then hours later they irradiated them, which caused severe delayed nausea.
So after they recovered,
The rats developed an extremely strong, long-lasting aversion to the salt solution, even after just one pairing.
even though the sickness was delayed by 12 hours, according to classical theory, shouldn't they have conditioned against the cage or the water dispenser?
They should have. But the key insight is that learning to avoid harmful food has a strong evolutionary genetic basis. Biologically, if you eat something that makes you sick, your brain assumes the taste or smell of that food caused it, even if the symptoms are delayed.
It's a survival mechanism.
It is. This preparedness overrides standard learning laws, because surviving the prehistoric environment meant quickly learning to avoid poisonous food.
And this absolutely applies to humans. We often develop a lifelong aversion to a food that made us sick years ago, even if we know perfectly well the sickness was caused by a virus.
It just shows the mind is not a blank slate. Learning is constrained by our biological preparedness.
Now, let's pivot to operant conditioning, or instrumental learning, where behavior is modified by its consequences.
Right, reinforcement. The idea is simple. Consequences drive future action. We use this all the time. But the sources issue a really strong caution about using punishment.
What are the three main negative consequences?
First, punishment, especially physical or aggressive punishment. It often generates negative emotions, not just in the recipient, but also in the punisher, and that leads to cycles of fear or aggression.
Second, overly strict or severe punishment.
Like constant shouting or public shaming can result in extreme fear and anxiety. It can actually worsen performance and sometimes even cause a child to become socially withdrawn.
And the third consequence is this generalized inhibitory effect.
This is maybe the most insidious. Punishment, rather than targeting only the one undesirable behavior, can cause the person to stop the entire related set of behaviors.
So constantly yelling at a child for talking back.
Might lead them to stop speaking to you altogether. It causes this generalized communicative inhibition. And punishment often only suppresses the behavior when the punishing authority is physically present.
A really dark psychological outcome tied to these repeated, uncontrollable negative experiences is learned helplessness.
Pioneered by Martin Seligman. It's what happens when an individual, after repeated failures, just resigns themselves to the belief that they can't change their circumstances.
Even when new opportunities or avenues for escape arise.
They simply stop trying. They believe effort is futile.
And what protects people from falling into that state?
Seligman identified the protective factor as an optimistic explanatory style. This is the tendency to attribute success to internal abilities. I succeeded because I'm competent. And to attribute failure to external temporary influences. I failed because the task was unfair.
It maintains a sense of control.
It does. And just like classical conditioning, operant conditioning also hits these biological limits, as shown by the famous misbehaving animals studied by the Breslin.
Right, they were students of B.F. Skinner.
And they found that highly reinforced behaviors could, over time, just be overridden by innate species-specific behaviors. Pigs trained to drop a coin into a bank would start treating the coin like food, rooting it around.
Raccoons would try to wash the coins.
Exactly. These are strong biological constraints that just prevent purely mechanical conditioning from succeeding long-term.
This inherent biological creativity really sets up the contrast with insight learning from Gestalt psychology. Wolfgang Kohler and his chimpanzee, Sultan. This wasn't reinforcement or trial and error.
Now, this was a sudden cognitive breakthrough. Sultan was faced with reaching a banana outside his cage using two short sticks. Individually, they were too short.
He tried each one and failed.
Right. The key moment was the insight, a sudden cognitive reorganization where he perceived a new relationship between the two sticks. He connected them into one long tool and then immediately used it successfully.
It wasn't a slow progression, it was instantaneous.
Exactly. A sudden perception of new relationships, what the Gestalt psychologists call the formation of a good shape. Kohler criticized trial and error learning because he said it only allowed for random behavior since the animals couldn't see the whole problem as a structured whole. Insight requires grasping the overall context.
Okay, let's jump into memory, starting with the limits of our system. We have to begin with iconic memory and George Sperling's classic experiment on ultra-short-term sensory storage.
Sperling used a tachistoscope to flash 12 letters for only 0.05 seconds. Subjects could only report 4 to 5 letters, but, and this is the key, they felt subjectively that they had seen all of them.
And he proved they saw all of them with the partial report method.
Yes. By sounding a high, medium, or low tone right after the flash to indicate which row to report, subjects could recall almost all the letters in that specified row.
Which proved the memory trace was initially perfect.
but it faded, dramatically disappearing in less than 1 second before they could verbally report all of it.
This high-speed fading brings us to the critical capacity of short-term memory, STM, constrained by George Miller's famous magic number 7.
7, plus or minus 2 items. STM is our cognitive workbench. And while newer research suggests we can handle verbal and visual stimuli at the same time, the capacity for verbal working memory remains tightly constrained to that small number of chunks.
And the constraints go beyond just the number of items, right? There's the word length effect.
Right. Long words are inherently harder to recall accurately than short words. And the reason is mechanical. It's related to rehearsal time. Speaking of repeating long words, the process you need to retain information in FTM, it just takes more time.
So the earlier items in the list decay before you can finish rehearsing.
That's the theory.
Moving to long-term memory, LTM, we have the concept of explicit subsystems, categorized by Endel Tolving.
Tolving differentiated between two relatively independent LTM systems. The first is episodic memory, which stores and retrieves personally experienced events. Things like where you were during a major world event, your wedding day, your first kiss.
The personal milestones that define our life narrative.
Exactly. And the sources stress that memories of these significant, intimate life events are often stored permanently, even if they become inaccessible at times.
And the second system
Is semantic memory. This stores general world knowledge, facts, concepts, definitions, vocabulary. Things like knowing who the first president was or how to do a math equation. It's encyclopedic knowledge, divorced from the personal context of where or when you learned it.
The organization of that semantic memory led to the semantic network theory.
Yes, tested by Collins and Quillian. They hypothesized that verifying sentences that required more movement in the semantic network would take longer, and they found that verifying a kingfisher as a bird was faster than verifying a kingfisher as an animal.
Which supported a hierarchical structure where related concepts are stored closer together.
It did, but that hierarchy model was later found to be a bit too rigid.
So it was refined into the spreading activation model.
By Collins and Loftus. In this model, activating a node, a concept like fire truck, immediately spreads activation to connected nodes like red, siren, engine, making that associated information easier and faster to retrieve. The links are based on semantic closeness, not just a rigid hierarchy.
There's one more crucial LTM theory, dual coding theory by Alan Paivio. This explains why some kinds of information are just easier to remember.
Paivio proposed that information is coded in two ways, verbally or imagistically. Concrete words like table, chair, dog are coded both verbally as sound word units and imagistically as mental pictures.
This dual encoding makes them easier to recall.
Yes, it's more robust, whereas abstract words like purpose, theory, or justice are coded primarily just verbally.
So because concrete words have two separate mental representations, their encoding is stronger.
It is. This underlies the crucial principle that the more deeply and diversely you encode a memory, the easier it is to access later.
This leads us to this quieting realization in all of memory research. The fabricated past. Our memories are not exact copies.
Not at all. Memory retrieval is an active process. It involves both reconstructive and constructive elements. When we reconstruct, we're filling in genuine gaps with probable data, what should have happened.
Yeah, and when we construct.
We unconsciously create entirely new, false data to make the memory more logical or cohesive, often incorporating details we learned later on.
And the most profound demonstration of how suggestion can create a false memory is the Loftus effect.
Elizabeth Loftus and Jay Palmer's 1974 car crash experiment is the definitive proof. Subjects watched a film of a car accident and were asked to estimate the speed when the cars smashed into each other versus when they hit each other.
And just changing that one single emotionally charged verb.
It significantly altered the reported speed estimates. Smashed led to much higher estimates than hit.
Which proves that post-event suggestion fundamentally alters the memory trace itself.
Precisely. And this highlights the critical fallibility of eyewitness testimony. Immediately after a traumatic event, witness statements are often fragmented and confused.
But through repeated questioning.
And the pressure to provide detail, witnesses unconsciously synthesize what actually happened with what could have happened. And they end up with a testimony that is often logically perfect, internally cohesive, but ultimately inaccurate and unreliable.
So we've established our perception is constructed and our memory is constantly being rewritten. Now we have to tackle the highest level function, thinking, section 4.
Thinking is the most complex cognitive process. It's internal, not directly observable. It's the processing and utilization of information, and its key functions are forming concepts, recognizing relationships, reasoning, and of course, problem solving.
And the sources categorize our thinking into three main kinds, based on the type of mental representation we're using.
First, there's concrete thinking, where we manipulate perceptions. This is the kind of thinking you use when you're troubleshooting a physical problem, like fixing an appliance,
Then there's figural or visual thinking.
where we manipulate mental images. Using your mind to plan an apartment layout or solve a complex geometry problem,
And finally, the highest level, abstract or conceptual thinking.
which relies entirely on manipulating symbols like verbal or mathematical signs. This is the foundation of logic and philosophy.
The power of that visual thinking was dramatically shown in Shepard and Metzler's 1971 research on mental rotation.
This is where they showed subjects images of 3D cubes and asked if one was a rotated version of the other.
And the reaction time was key.
They found that the subject's reaction time was directly and linearly correlated with the degree of mental rotation required to align the two images.
So people solved the problem by mentally rotating the image at a consistent, measurable rate.
About 60 degrees per second. It proves that visual imagery is functionally analogous to physical movement, and it's highly reliable. This capability, of course, is a staple of intelligence tests.
Moving from rotation to categorization, let's talk about the tricky issue of concepts, especially in humanistic sciences like psychology. Many key terms, talent, personality, mental health, are what the sources call indeterminate or fuzzy concepts.
These concepts lack a clear, strictly defined core set of attributes. Ulrich Neisser famously noted that judging an intelligent person relies not on a rigid checklist of criteria, but on how similar that person is to a mental prototype of intelligence, just like how we judge a mundane object like a chair.
So there are no unambiguous defining criteria for chairness that exclude all other possibilities.
Exactly. A rocking chair, a beanbag chair, an office chair. They all fit the prototype, but they share very few necessary universal features. And this lack of clear definition makes scientific discourse difficult, but it reflects the complexity of the human world.
This lack of clarity often leads to the systematic errors we make in reasoning, cognitive biases and heuristics. And the first, arguably most powerful, is confirmation bias.
This is the strong human tendency to seek out, attend to, and favor information that confirms our existing beliefs, while actively ignoring or downplaying contradictory information.
If you have a firm opinion on a political issue, you will probably only read news sources that confirm your existing view.
You will. And why is this bias so persistent, even though it causes us to cling to false opinions? The sources suggest it's highly beneficial for cognitive economy.
It's just efficient.
It's very efficient. Maintaining a stable set of opinions saves the immense mental effort required to constantly rethink and reevaluate your initial assumptions every time new information appears. It's a shortcut we subconsciously prefer over pure accuracy.
And that idea of an efficiency shortcut leads directly to heuristics, the mental shortcuts identified by Tversky and Kahneman.
They're often effective, but systematically prone to error. We have three essential examples here. The first is the representativeness heuristic,
where we judge the probability of an event based on how similar it is to a mental prototype or how random it appears.
The coin toss example is the most illustrative. If you flip a coin 6 times, which sequence seems more probable, HH, HTTT, or HTHPTH?
Most people will say the second one.
They do, even though both are mathematically equally likely. They judge probability based on a superficial resemblance to randomness.
The second is the availability heuristic.
This is where we judge the probability of an event by how easily relevant examples come to mind. If we can recall examples easily, we judge the event as more common.
Which is why people often overestimate the frequency of dramatic, rare events like plane crashes or shark attacks.
Precisely. They are highly publicized, emotionally salient, easily available in memory, so we overestimate their actual statistical frequency compared to, say, common household accidents.
And then there is the anchoring and adjustment heuristic.
This one is insidious. It states that initial numbers, even if completely irrelevant, anchor our subsequent estimates. We adjust from that starting point, but usually insufficiently.
The factorial sequence example showed this perfectly.
Yes. Tversky and Kahneman asked subjects to estimate the product of two sequences, one starting high, 8 by 7 by 6, and one starting low, 1 by 2 by 3.
And because the first sequence started with high numbers,
People estimated a much, much higher final result, even though the final mathematical results of the two sequences were identical. They anchored on those initial high numbers and failed to adjust downward enough.
These shortcuts are then compounded by the framing effect. People's preferences change dramatically depending on how information is presented.
Another key Kahneman and Tversky finding. The life-saving scenario is the perfect illustration. When presented with two plans for combating a disease that kills 600 people, people choose a plan when it's framed as a certain gain. Plan A saved 200 lives. They avoid the risky option.
But if you frame the identical outcomes as potential losses,
They switch preferences completely. When presented as potential losses, Plan D risk losing all 600 lives, people suddenly prefer the risky alternative. They avoid unnecessary risk when the outcome is a gain, but they become risk seekers when the outcome is framed as avoiding a certain loss. The language dictates the decision.
our final complexity in thinking is creativity and problem solving. A major barrier here is functional fixation.
This is the inability to see objects beyond their typical established use. The sources cite Dunker's candle problem. Subjects were given a candle, matches, and a box of tacks and asked to fix the candle to the wall.
And many subjects failed because they only saw the box as a container for the text.
Exactly. They failed to see the box as a potential platform. Similarly, Mayer's plier string problem required seeing the pliers not just as a gripping tool, but as a pendulum weight. Overcoming functional fixation requires a cognitive leap.
A leap often facilitated by the power of analogy.
The classic example is the radiation problem. How to destroy a tumor with radiation without killing the healthy tissue around it. Very few students solved it initially,
But then they were given the military analogy.
and 75% of them solved it successfully. The analogy was how to attack a central fortress by dividing the army into small groups approaching from different directions that converge simultaneously.
The analogy provides the structural key.
It does. Converging low-intensity rays are analogous to converging small units. It facilitates a complete mental reorganization of the problem.
And this kind of specialized thinking leads us to the difference between novice and expert performance.
Robert Glazer and Micheline Key's research showed that experts are highly specialized. They excel only in their specific domain.
But within that domain, they operate very differently.
They don't just possess more facts. They deeply understand the problem. They form sophisticated mental representations. And crucially, experts continuously monitor their progress, refining their thought processes, using errors as data points to improve.
Finally, let's detail the structured stages of the creative process defined by Graham Wallace.
Wallace described 4 stages that are surprisingly consistent. First is preparation, gathering information, intense study. Second is incubation, stepping away and letting the unconscious mind work.
Third is illumination, the sudden aha moment.
And fourth is verification, where the idea is tested, refined, and applied.
The incubation phase is the most famous part, the part that feels like magic.
It's often referred to as the 3 Bs, the bus, the bath, and the bed, where breakthrough ideas frequently occur when the individuals relax and not actively thinking about the problem. The mind is allowed to reorganize the material outside of conscious control. The illumination phase is that sudden realization, where all the fragments reorganize into a meaningful whole.
We have mapped perception, memory, and high-level thought. Now we have to address the engine that drives them, motivation, drives, and the emotional brain in Section 5.
We have to begin with the most basic biological forces, governed by drive theory from Clark Hull. This theory states that behavior is fundamentally motivated by the need to reduce an unpleasant internal tension or deficiency, the drive.
This drive is unobservable, but we infer it from behavior. A hungry animal seeks food faster than a satiated one.
Exactly. And this system works through homeostatic regulation, maintaining internal balance like a finely tuned thermostat.
The body uses these complex, automated mechanisms to constantly avoid deficiency and excess.
A key example is temperature regulation. If you're too warm, you get vasodilation widening the blood vessels to bring more blood to the surface to cool down. If you're too cold, vasoconstriction narrowing the vessels to restrict blood flow and conserve heat. This striving for balance is the core mechanism.
But when we move to complex human motives, things get, well, complicated, starting with hunger or alimentary behavior.
Historically, there were very simplistic theories, like Cannon's, which linked the feeling of hunger directly to stomach contractions. He even had a subject swallow a balloon to measure them.
But we now know that's insufficient.
We know that hunger is regulated by an immensely complex interplay of hormones, biochemical signals, and nervous processes in the hypothalamus.
And hunger, a basic drive, is so profoundly shaped by psychosocial factors.
Absolutely. Beyond physiology, Cultural norms dictate what we eat, when we eat, and how much we eat. And social ideals deeply define our body schema.
The Fallon and Rosen study on body size ideals is striking.
It is. American men prefer a body shape similar to their own, but American women prefer a body shape far thinner than their own actual proportions, and crucially, far thinner than the shape their male partners actually prefer.
So cultural pressure and self-perception are overriding both biological reality and partner preference.
It highlights a deep-seated cultural anxiety influencing a fundamental biological drive. Furthermore, eating behavior is often highly symbolic and ritualistic.
Like the source notes, the strong, unifying motive to eat carp and potato salad on Christmas Eve in the Czech Republic.
An act that deeply symbolizes family cohesion and tradition. The need to adhere to the tradition becomes as strong as the physical need for nourishment.
Next, let's discuss the uniquely human motive of sexuality. The sources stress that, unlike hunger, it is not purely homeostatic.
No, sexual motivation is distinct from that deficiency model of hunger. Sexual desire often does not lead to activity, and people actively seek arousal. I mean, look at the immense commercial success of erotic media, even without the aim of orgasm or releasing tension.
It's not simply about reducing a deficiency.
It's often about seeking pleasure and connection. And the social and cultural influence on this drive is enormous.
Sexual morals are so variable.
Very. The strict norms of the early 20th century, particularly for women, created massive internal conflicts between innate desire and imposed moral standards, often leading to widespread neuroses.
And the sources suggest the psychological ideal is realizing these desires within a long-term, loving relationship.
Where sexuality is in the service of love, facilitating a temporary dissolving of personal boundaries and emotional fusion with a partner.
Moving to the immediate, powerful mechanism of the emotional response system, we start with the physical reaction that prepares us for action.
Physiological arousal is primarily mediated by the sympathetic nervous system. This triggers the fight or flight response.
Increased heart rate, sweating, rapid breathing.
And the massive release of adrenaline and noradrenaline, which maintain and support this systemic activation, prepping the body for immediate, intense activity.
This response system relies on specific ancient brain structures, notably the limbic system.
The limbic system is the emotional center. The cingulate gyrus, septum, hippocampus, hypothalamus. But the central player in primitive, fast emotion is the amygdala, often called the fear center.
Joseph Ledoux's work on the amygdala is key to understanding why we sometimes react before we even know why.
Ledoux discovered a critical functional shortcut. A fast, direct, low-road connection that runs straight from the sensory organ, via the thalamus, to the amygdala, completely bypassing the cortex, the thinking part of the brain.
Which allows for this quick, unconscious processing of danger signals.
So the organism can instantly freeze or flee before the thinking, reasoning part of the brain is even fully aware of the threat. The slower, more deliberate high road follows later via the cortex.
This structural distinction leads us to the classic theories on the origin of emotion. First, the counterintuitive James Lange theory, body first.
William James and Carl Lange famously flipped the common sense notion that we feel fear and then we tremble.
They argued it's the other way around.
They argued that an emotional stimulus causes a physiological or behavioral response first, trembling, clenching a fist, sweating. The conscious perception of those bodily changes is the emotion, as they put it. I'm afraid because I tremble.
Our feelings are just a conscious side product of our body's automatic response.
That's the theory. Then you have the more complex Schachter-Singer two-factor theory, which reintroduced cognition.
They propose two distinct components are necessary.
Right. First, physiological arousal, the body's engine turning on, which must then be cognitively interpreted or labeled based on the context to become a specific emotion. Arousal alone is undifferentiated. The label makes it anger or joy.
And they tested this with the famous Ciproxin experiment.
Subjects were injected with adrenaline to cause identical generalized physiological arousal. Those who are informed about the drug's physical effects experienced little emotion because they attributed the arousal to the pill.
But those who were not informed,
They attributed the unexplained arousal to the social context provided by an actor, experiencing either intense anger or euphoria depending on the actor's behavior. Arousal plus a cognitive label equals emotion.
finally, we have cognitive appraisal theory by Richard Lazarus, which puts thinking front and center.
Lazarus argued that emotion arises from a primary cognitive appraisal of the situation. Before anything else, we quickly and often unconsciously ask, am I in trouble? Is this relevant to me?
And negative emotions arise specifically from perceived threats, loss, or challenges.
Exactly. Threat is the anticipation of loss. This highlights how cognitive restructuring can be used therapeutically. If you can change how you appraise the situation, you can fundamentally change your emotional response to it.
Let's wrap up this section by discussing the mind's essential maintenance system, defense mechanisms.
These defenses operate to protect the ego from overwhelming instinctual wishes, like unbridled aggression and unbearable effects, particularly anxiety.
And George Vaillant focused on the more mature, healthy defenses used by mentally healthy adults.
Yes, highly adaptive, constructive ways to manage inner conflicts. The first is altruism.
Providing others with the good things we secretly wish to receive ourselves.
It is a defense that is simultaneously self-satisfying and constructive for society.
Next, humor.
Humor allows for the expression of negative feelings without subjective distress. It brings relief from feelings of helplessness by allowing you to transcend the unpleasant emotional reality and reshape it with wit.
And finally, sublimation, the classic healthy defense.
Sublimation involves transforming unacceptable, intense impulses like aggression or strong sexual energy into socially acceptable and often highly productive activities like competitive sports, artistic pursuits, or demanding scientific research. It channels that internal energy into productive external outlets.
That was an incredible journey, moving from microscopic sensory input right up to the grand, complex architecture of human thought and motivation.
We started this deep dive with a huge goal: to give you the essential truth about the human mind.
And I think we achieved it by synthesizing these core findings. We learned that perception is not a passive receipt of data, but an active, subjective construction.
Heavily influenced by our top-down expectations, our internal knowledge, and our deep-seated motivations.
We saw that memory is fundamentally reconstructive. It is not a video recorder, and it's terrifyingly susceptible to external suggestion.
Proving that our recollections are often more cohesive and logical than they are actually accurate.
And we explored how our decision-making, while it feels so intentional and conscious, is just riddled with systematic errors and cognitive shortcuts.
Those powerful heuristics, often driven by this complex interplay of unconscious drives and acquired, culturally influenced motivations.
The knowledge distilled here really reveals that the human experience is incredibly rich, but we are often so unaware of the true, subtle drivers of our behavior.
We think we are making deliberate choices, but we are frequently just rationalizing actions that have already been determined by deeper, faster, less conscious processes.
Which brings us right back to the most profound complexity we talked about at the start, the question of free will itself.
The deepest dive into this source material shows that the strong, comforting belief in free will might, in fact, be an illusion. You have the uncomfortable implications of the work of researchers like Benjamin Libet.
Libet's confusing, seminal experiments that showed the brain activity, the readiness potential related to voluntary action, appears before the subject is consciously aware of the intention to act.
The motor system starts before consciousness is even informed.
This lends powerful support to the idea that our conscious mind is just the spokesperson, as Dennett suggested.
Interpreting and narrating actions already determined by internal nervous programs or powerful latent influences. Yet, the psychological capacity for intentional goal-directed behavior remains a core pillar of psychological study.
So, here is our provocative closing thought for you, the learner. If our perception is constructed, our memory is constantly being rewritten, and the initial spark of our most significant choices might be predetermined by nervous activity that precedes our awareness. What then is the true, independent measure of our individual identity, and where exactly does the singular self truly reside?
Consider how much of your daily life, your spontaneous laughter, your professional decisions, your sudden craving for something sweet, is truly intentional versus merely being rationalized and integrated into your life's narrative after the fact. The pursuit of that self continues to be psychology's greatest, most sensitive challenge.
Thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We hope this accelerated you on your path to being profoundly well-informed.